So the reading I'm going to do is from Luke 6:39 to 49. Jesus also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eyes and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye," when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck the house, but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck, that house is collapsed. Its destruction was complete.
Thank you, Louise. I love the way Jesus has such clear pictures, doesn't he? He really helps us to understand. Come up, my sister, and pray for you. Oh, Lord, we thank you so much for our beautiful sister Claire. We just thank you for the amazing blessings she is to us. Just pray that you would just speak through her tonight, Lord God, and give us ears to listen. Amen.
Amen. Okay. I'm wondering how many other typos there are on the slide, because that was actually Luke 6. I know it said Luke 5. Apologies. So evening, everyone. It's been a great weekend away. But Raf, I'm just thinking, where are the youth? Where's their stamina? Well done, Saren. All credit to Sarah. I think Saren deserves a round of applause for making church. I understand all the others have gone back to bed. What is that about? But I had a great weekend, and I got to do something on the weekend that I wanted to do for a while. Fly. Excellent. So yeah, we've all had a good weekend. So today we're looking at heart transplants. And I wonder what we think of when I say that. Let me get the clicker. Maybe it's Grey's Anatomy, the show that I first heard of in lockdown because some members of my family decided to binge watch it. It wasn't me, though, because I have to close my eyes when I see them cutting people open on TV. Or when I asked James earlier this week, he reminded me of this game that he played as a child. Anyone else remember playing it? You'll be pleased to know that I can keep my eyes open on these operations, though. That's good. And then I had a little search around the internet to see what I could find out about heart transplants. So who knows when the first successful heart transplant was in the UK? Andy. Oh, he put his hand up too soon. He didn't wait till the end. It's because on this piece of paper it says in the UK. And that's what the question is. It was South Africa. Oh, well, and it was when? Poland. Well, in the UK, just to stop there, in the UK, anyone know when it was in the UK? 1979. And And do you know roughly how many heart transplants happen in the UK? This is the UK, just to say, each year? About 200, and about 10 of them are in Wales. Then, as of March 2025, there were 308 patients on the active transplant waiting list. So there, guys, is some more useful information for you. I hope you're taking note, because you never know, in one of our quizzes, we might just have a round on Claire's talks, and you might want to just remember them. Just put that out there. So as I was researching this, I read on the British Heart Foundation website that a heart transplant is when a damaged or failing heart is replaced by a healthy human heart from a donor. So keep that in mind for later. I thought before we dig into Luke 6 today, it would be good to step back and just remind ourselves of what we have already considered so far in this series as we've stepped through Luke. So I'm sure you'll all remember Pete kicked off the series with Luke 4, looking at Jesus' mission and ministry. And he left us with a challenge to be bold and to step into the situations that the Holy Spirit leads us into, remembering that Jesus doesn't call the equipped, but he equips the called. And then I'm sure you all remember the following week when I spoke on Jesus' call to his disciples to follow him, and how that same call is for us today. Just to check if anyone was listening, quick test. Who's the most followed person on social media? Excellent, Raf. And how many followers did he have? Yeah, over a billion. I'm glad Raf was listening. And then 2 weeks ago, Craig looked at the last part of Luke 5, which introduced the whole idea of Jesus was coming to bring something new. When we compare the teachings of Jesus with traditional Jewish beliefs, they are like new garments or wineskins. And Craig reminded us, he remarked how Jesus didn't come to patch up our old lives, but he came to give us a new one. Look, if you've missed any of those talks so far, can I encourage you to go on YouTube? They're all on there, and it'd be good to catch up and keep in step with the series. So as we dive into chapter 6, we're going to take a closer look at what Jesus was teaching and how Jesus, rather than trying to placate the Pharisees, and for those who might not know what Pharisees are, that's the religious leaders of the day, but instead of trying to placate them, he instead throws down the gauntlet to them. So, who spent some time this week reading chapter 6? Oh, a couple of hands, brilliant. So there's so much in there that we're not going to barely scratch the surface of that today. So if you haven't already gone away and read chapter 6, can I just encourage you to take some time this week to read it? Because as I said, there is so much great stuff in there. Again, before digging into the teachings, can we just pause and ponder a little the concept that Craig introduced about the old and the new? You know, I think it's really important to note that Jesus isn't throwing away the old law. He's come to reframe the law. Jesus talked about replacing old wineskins with new wineskins. But let's remind ourselves, he's talking about putting wine still in wineskins. He is still talking about the life that we should live in relationship to our Father. But as we'll see later, it's a life lived out of a heart transformation rather than blindly following a set of rules. I'm a little bit tired, as you can tell. I'm getting my words jumbled. I do apologize. He's not abolishing the old law, but he's come to fulfill it. He's setting new standards of behavior, which have to do with an inward character rather than an outward observation. And we see this actually in the first part of Luke chapter 6, when Luke writes about observing the Sabbath. Jesus wasn't saying that we shouldn't observe the Sabbath, but when there's a choice between rules and compassion, we should be moved towards compassion rather than just blindly following rules. It's been quite interesting, actually, to read through the whole of chapter 6 and see the thread that Luke has running through this chapter. After this section about the Sabbath at the start, Luke slots in the announcement of the 12 disciples, as if he's further making that point that he's replacing the 12 tribes of Israel, which marked the old covenant, with the 12 disciples that reflect the new. Again, pointing towards Jesus reframing the old law. There's lots we could pick up on, actually, in relation to Jesus selecting his disciples, but we don't have time. But here's another, something interesting that jumped out to me. I don't know if you'd ever noticed before, I hadn't, but when he's written the names of the disciples, he actually writes the name of Judas Iscariot, the traitor, very early on in the Luke of Gospel, as if when we're reading the rest of Luke's Gospel, he wants us to read it knowing that all that happened, he knew that back then. That was the case back then. I don't know if anyone else has noticed that right at the start, it wasn't just as it happened. Right at the start, it said he was going to be the traitor. And don't you just love it, actually, that when you read the Bible, new things just keep jumping out at you. There's always something new that we get when we read the Bible. God's always speaking to us. I can't tell you how many tangents I went off on this week. But lastly, before digging into Jesus' teachings, one question that the Pharisees needed to ask, along with the crowd that was following Jesus, and that same question is important for us today, and that is, who was Jesus to think that he could reframe the Jewish law? What authority did he have to do that? You know, were they going to accept that he was the Son of Man? We see from the text, actually, that the Pharisees appeared to reject his claim and go off and plot, it says, what they were going to do with him rather than listen to his teachings in the rest of the chapter. But I think the real question is, but what about us? Do we accept the claim that Jesus is the Son of God, the promised Messiah? Do we accept that Jesus is who he said he was? And that he has the authority to actually reframe the law. You know, this is such an important question, isn't it, for each and every one of us? Because if you do believe he is, then lean in and dig into the rest of the teachings that he's given to us. But if you don't believe that he's the Son of Man, then who is he to teach us how to live? Or maybe you don't know what you think about that question. And if that's you, can I suggest you sign on to the next Alpha course? Because it is actually designed to help us answer that very question. So in summary, we have briefly seen that Jesus is redefining the world and positioning as a foundation God now as a merciful Father. And on this foundation, he is building new practices, perceptions and attitudes. He's named new leaders, and he now defines the new conditions of existence in that community and the general shape of our behaviours, and appreciation that can come to seem natural for those who now participate in that community. So in the first 11 verses of chapter 6, the observers that we read about were actually the Pharisees, who were monitoring, questioning and spying on Jesus. However, from verse 17, it's somewhat different. We read this, and I hope I'm on the right one, yeah, and it says Luke 6 as well, or hey. It says, he went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the coastal regions around Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him, it said, and to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. So now it says, rather than the Pharisees, now we have a crowd who were there to receive from Jesus' ministry and not evaluate it in the way that the Pharisees were. And it is to this crowd that we should note that the remainder of this chapter is spoken. So the challenge at this point is, how can I possibly unpack all of the nuggets from Jesus' teaching that are contained in the rest of this chapter in such a short time? So I'm not going to try. You'll be pleased to know. Instead, I'm going to skip over large portions of it and just pull out a few little nuggets from it. So Jesus, following announcing his disciples, begins his discourse by sharing 4 promises and 4 warnings that were known as the Beatitudes, before he moves on to what has been one of the most, I believe, challenging passages of the Bible, when Jesus exhorts us to love our enemies. I'm going to mostly leave that for another day, but actually I do want to just stop for a minute and say that as Jesus is reframing the law, he's calling us to see as God sees and to act as God acts, to not just follow this call of duty, but to live out a call of love. And in this, not just to act with love towards those who deserve it, but actually to love in that same way to anyone, to those people who don't deserve it. Jesus is calling us to love outlandishly and absurdly generously. N.T. Wright suggests that Christians should live with no violence or revenge. There should be no division in class, and property and possessions should never be more important than making sure your neighbour is okay. You know, he claims that if more people took Jesus seriously, life would be exuberant, life would be different, astonishing, and people would stare. And he goes on to point out that, of course, people did stare at Jesus because he lived that way himself. And do you know what? The reason why the crowds stared, I've lost my point. The reason why the crowds gathered was that power was flowing out of Jesus, and people were being healed. His whole life was one of exuberant generosity, giving all that he had to give to everyone who needed it. You know, Jesus was speaking of what he knew, the extravagant love of his Father and the call to live a lavish human life in response to that. Very challenging and thought-provoking stuff to love as Jesus did. Actually, 2 weeks ago, Sam, our son, got married, and I had the privilege of speaking on what must have been one of the most well-known passages in the Bible. It's read out at just about every wedding, well, at least everyone that I've attended, and that is 1 Corinthians 13, where it says, "Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy." I'm sure you know the passage. And you know, in the context of weddings, we take these verses that Paul shares, which can be summarized in the phrase, "others first," and we apply them to how we love the person that we've chosen to spend the rest of our lives with. And that feels hard enough, doesn't it, Kel? Yet Jesus here in chapter 6 is challenging us to love in that same extravagant way, not just to those that we love, but actually, or like, but to those who are our enemies, those who just don't deserve it. That same love that we're challenged to love there to those people. I know I said I would leave that discussion for another time, but I couldn't help but mention it and wonder what a different world we would live in if more of us were to love like Jesus loved. You know, would there be so many wars in our world if people were to put what other people wanted before their own? You know, would there be so many relationship breakdowns if our love was firstly about loving others and not about ourselves? You know, Jesus' new reframing of the law calls us to want the best for those who are against us, and to even go as far as putting them and their needs ahead of our own. There's this verse in Romans 5 where Paul wrote that whilst we were still sinners and far away from God, Christ, out of his great love for us, still came and he died for us. He's calling us, guys, to live in the same way. So please, can I encourage you to go away and ponder that thought some more? It is so important. I'm just going to skip over the next section with a slide because a picture is worth 1,000 words. N.T. Wright shares how Jesus is ending out this chapter with 4 vivid sketches that are meant to be funny, actually. And he says he claims that they reflected typical Jewish humor whilst making some deadly serious points that Jesus intended the crowd to remember. So giving it in a picture form meant that they could go away and hopefully remember the deadly serious points. So these first two are on screen, and I'll say no more about them, except that they too speak of behaviors that Jesus expects in this new community of believers. But I would like to spend the rest of the time considering in more detail the third and fourth pictures that Jesus presented to us. So thirdly, the picture that Jesus presents to us is a tree and the fruit that they bear. We read that no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. Rog, it won't surprise you that I need to go and Google a few of these things and find out what these plants and trees are, but I did get the gist that involved a lot of thorns and brambles. I was reading a commentary by Joel Green on this, and he raised an interesting point that According to the finale of the sermon, Jesus is concerned with the nature of a person, the heart. But such a concern does not lead to what today we call psychological evaluation. In Luke's pre-Freudian world, a person's inside is accessible not through his or her psychology, but through his or her social interactions. People, like trees, are known for what they produce. That's a challenge, isn't it? We will be known by the fruit that we produce. In fact, one commentator wrote that fruit, including speech, is our signature, exposing the heart. And perhaps we need to modify that saying today. Perhaps it should be fruit, including speech, is our PIN code or our face recognition, exposing the heart, because signatures are becoming somewhat a little bit outdated, I think. But our signature, though, is a means of authenticating who we are. And the fruit we produce is likewise a way of authenticating our heart's condition. The fruit that we bear in our speech and actions reflects the underlying beliefs, attitudes, and motivations of our heart. William Barclay, I know Anna loves William Barclay, points out that Jesus is reminding us here that the words of our lips show what is on our heart. We can't speak of God with our words unless God's Spirit is in our heart. When expanding on this, Barclay gave an interesting analogy that if you ask someone for directions, one person might say it's near such and such a church. Someone else might say it's near such and such a cinema, or it's near such and such a football ground or a bar. The very words of the answer to this chance question often show where our thoughts most naturally turn and where the interests of our hearts lie. And I thought that was an interesting analogy. And whether you totally agree with that analogy or not, I think it's true, actually, that the words we speak when caught off guard do reveal sometimes what's on our heart. Anyone else reminded of the times when they wish they hadn't been caught off guard because they weren't proud of what it might have revealed of their heart? It's clear to me from this passage that moral reformation, which leaves the heart untouched, is not what Jesus wanted then, and it's not what he wants now. Jesus is inviting his hearers to a way of life which is so completely new that it needs a change of heart, a change deep down in our personality. You know, we started tonight by talking about heart transplants. And what Jesus is inviting us into here is to have his heart transplanted into us. So what about us? What is in our hearts? Has our heart been transformed by the audacious love of God? You know, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were trying to achieve moral reformation by religiously following a set of rules and ordering others to do the same. You know, we striving to bear fruit, trying by our own efforts to do the right thing? Or have we invited Jesus into our life to clean up our hearts and to let our words and our actions flow out from inside of us? Challenging questions to take away. And this leads us onto the fourth and final parable of this section, the wise and the foolish builder. Maybe when you think of this parable, you think actually it's a story for the kids. But one of the lasting achievements of Jesus was to tell such vivid and easily memorable stories that people of every age and every part of the world could hear a word for themselves from them. In verse 46, Jesus throws out the question, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" You know, Jesus is asking them how they can call him Lord, which is a term of great respect, and one to whom they are pledging their allegiance, and then not grant them his allegiance. You know, the question is, on what basis might people refer to Jesus as Lord? Who was Jesus speaking to here? And one commentator suggests that within the structure of Jesus' message, the corresponding answer would be that they must embrace his topsy-turvy characterization of the world, be transformed in their disposition, and engage in loving their enemies. the doing of good, the lending without expectation of return, that the practices determined by the gracious character of God. That is the basis for which people would be calling them Lord. But again, who's he speaking to? Well, it's worth noting that in Luke's gospel to this point, only 2 people have actually referred to Jesus as Lord, and that is Peter and the guy who was cured of leprosy. So the question is, was this a rebuke to them because they'd called him Lord? Well, it's unlikely that it was, it's claimed. And it's unlikely that Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees because actually they weren't acknowledging him as Lord. So it's therefore believed that Jesus was addressing more those who would go on to address him as Lord. This is for those who would go on to address him. And as I mentioned earlier, the audience was made up of people who were eager to come and hear. And Jesus is providing here an illustration of the importance of adding obedience to that eagerness to come in and hear in. Making the point, actually, that listening to true wisdom, he's giving all this wisdom, and listening to the wisdom and not putting it into practice is like building without foundations. The people were eager to come and hear Jesus, and now they were being challenged to take additional steps in response to him. It's suggested that to get the real picture behind the parable, we need to read the version in Matthew 7, in Matthew's gospel. Luke was not a native of Palestine, so he may not have had such a clear understanding of what Jesus was saying, whereas Matthew was. And in the summer, many of the riverbeds dried up altogether and left a sandy bed where there was no water and almost no evidence that it was part of a riverbed. But in winter, after the summer rains came, the empty riverbed became a raging torrent. Many men, when looking for a site to build their house, found this inviting stretch of sand, had perhaps had no idea what was to come, and built on it, only to discover that his house ended up in the middle of this raging river and was swept away. How many of us, I suppose, suffer from being deceived like this in life? We see something appealing, something exciting, something enjoyable, and we don't stop and consider the long-term effects of our decision. We don't think about what might happen. Maybe we think that disaster isn't going to happen to us. Or maybe we don't care about what might happen in the future, what storms may be coming. We're short-sighted, and we think we'll deal with that when it happens. We had a conversation about that last night, didn't we, Kath? Instant pleasure is what interests us. As I thought about this, I was reminded of the many people who live like this today. People who are looking for quick wins and shortcuts in life. I'm sure we can all think of many people and scenarios, and probably we've done it many times ourselves. But yeah, what about us? Are we living for the now? Maximum happiness and pleasure right now in our life? Or are we taking that long-term view and building for eternity? Verse 48 says, they are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundations on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built. It doesn't take a genius to work out that the effort to lay foundations on rock is far greater than the effort to dig foundations in the sand. Do we fall into this trap that we decide to save time and not put in the hard work required to build deep and solid foundations? We need to be sure that our lives are built on solid foundation of knowing and trusting Jesus Christ. And we need to be prepared to invest time in doing this, not just in hearing, but in obeying as well. We started by talking about the old law and the new law that Jesus was instituting. We should note that the demands of the new law are actually higher than that of the old law and can be summarized up by this one word, obedience, summed up even. There's a danger here when we read these passages that we jump to the conclusion that Jesus is fundamentally concerned with actions. So I just want to say that would actually be misguided. For Jesus, character and actions are inseparable. And this brings us back to how our hearts are revealed in our actions. Again, actions are not enough if they're not born out of our heart. Jesus Jesus calls us for total transformation, for consistency of a person inside and out. So let me start to draw this to a close by a quote with N.T.'s summary of this whole chapter. I think he summarizes it quite well. The question is, of course, are we today so keen on looking for specks in other people's eyes that we can't see the plank in our own? Do our plans and schemes look good on the outside, but leave our hearts untouched? Are we building without a foundation? As we ask these questions about ourselves and watch out in case we're lured into these traps by others, we must maintain as a basic rule of life the generous, free-spirited approach of the previous part of the sermon. Jesus' radical offer of new and abundant life is so all-embracing and hence so all-demanding that people try to find alternative ways, but they must be resisted or our house will come down with a crash. What a great passage. So much we could take from it. And I hope you've enjoyed pondering it as much as I have. And I hope you'll go away and ponder it some more. But as we go into a time of worship now, let's reflect on what we are building our lives on. Let's reflect on on whether our words and our actions actually flow out from a heart transformation. And let's reflect on whether we love audaciously and outrageously like Jesus did. Joe.